My name is Adam Scott Neal. I'm a composer, teacher, and writer, and I've been fascinated by musical instruments my whole life. Each instrument has personality and colors that create vivid aural images and moods. On this podcast, I talk to people who play, study, and compose for these instruments to uncover their meanings and hear pieces that best show off their personalities. Join me as we open Instrument Cases. Today we're going to talk about the flute. Unlike previous episodes where the instrument was more singular and specific, here we really have a class of instruments. Essentially, a flute is a cylinder that resonates because someone is blowing across an open hole. The length of the cylinder determines the key of the flute, and most of them have holes that can be covered or uncovered to change the pitch. Flutes appear in many cultures across the globe, and we can't possibly cover them all here. That said, we're somewhat skipping over the modern flute used in bands and orchestras to talk about some of its siblings and cousins. My guests today include Hongda Chin, a composer and performer on both Western and Chinese flutes; Jeana Melilli, a performer and musicologist who specializes in piccolo and Baroque flute; and Carla Rees, a performer and composer known for working almost exclusively with low flutes. I like to start the show by asking for 3 words that describe the instrument. First, Hongda names 3 words about the flute. Jeana has 3 for the flute and 3 more for the piccolo, and then Carla offers 3 each for the alto and bass flutes.
Shadowy, brilliant or bright, and pale.
Pretty, because we always have the melody. Silvery, for modern flute especially, but I love silver and I love that kind of metal sound. And then windy, because it is air across the silver and it is the wind. But for piccolo, that one's easier for me. I think like screamy, ridiculous, and fun. It's just a great instrument.
So yeah, if I'm going to describe the alto flute, I think I would go for soulful, expressive, and maybe adventurous. It's interesting because they all have different personalities. I think the bass flute is perhaps more elegant in a way. That's quite a good word to describe the bass flute. Rich and deep, obviously, in terms of the sound. It's got a certain elegance, except if you go high and then it's a bit squawky, but that's part of its character as well. Am I allowed soulful again?
We'll dive into repertoire for the different flutes later in the show, but to start off, Hongda spoke about one piece that he feels encapsulates the flute's personality well. It's Syrinx by Claude Debussy.
I think Syrinx is really a piece that people should know about the flute. I think it's a very special piece that paint flute in a different way than what was the pieces that were written for the flute before that, with the scales used to paint a certain colors at certain moments in Syrinx. For example, like the pentatonic scale is used, whole tone scale is used, chromaticism is used. All of these different scales are used to give a certain color to the piece, and on top of that, with the timbre of the flute that gives it like a fantasy, like a world of fantasy through the scales and the timbre of the flute. I think that is quite magical.
Instruments can be such a prominent part of our identities as musicians, so I think it's important to hear about everyone's journey with their instrument. As you'll hear, there's often a moment where one falls in love with the sound and the character of the instrument, and then playing it becomes a lifelong obsession. First, here's Jeana Melilli.
So I started playing the piano when I was 5, and then my mom was a big band geek and wanted to major in the clarinet when she graduated high school, and her parents wouldn't let her. She wanted me to be in the band, and I was like, well, I want to play the French horn because I am left-handed. Everybody was like, well, okay, but you're also like not going to be much taller than 5 feet. Like, let's think this through. And eventually it was my orthodontist who was like, no, you can't, because I had braces. So mom said, well, I started on the flute, and then I switched to the clarinet, and I wanted to switch back to flute, and I couldn't. So why don't you try the flute? And I did, and I stuck with it. I went all the way through master's degree with flute performance degrees, took lots of auditions, and then I started also experimenting with Baroque flute. I went to Wild Acres in North Carolina for their flute thing, and I heard someone said, you should go across the street. I was there to hear William Bennett play, who was a very famous flute player, and it was wonderful to sit through his master classes. And somebody said, oh, you should go across the way and go to one of Stephen Preston's master classes. And so I did, and I didn't leave for the rest of the week. I just stayed there. I was fascinated by the sound and by a completely different way of thinking about music, where the instrument kind of dictates what you do, and it's much more in touch with the meter and the, endless inventiveness of the forms of the Baroque period. And I was lucky enough to get with some groups like the Savannah Baroque started back in 2015, and then a couple other like Baroque music enthusiasts in Columbia with the Vista Ensemble. And we were just able to get together and play and just there's really great musicians, and they come out of the woodwork. If you find one gambist, then you're good to go. And you can, play all this great repertoire. So it's always been in the background since that moment of going to those master classes, and changes the way you play modern flute and the way you think about even orchestral playing. And it's just been really great to experience all that.
Well, I was born in and grew up in Malaysia, which is a multicultural country.
This is Hongda Chin.
I was very fortunate to be able to go to a Chinese elementary and high school. In the elementary school and high school that I went to, they did have a Chinese orchestra program that I took part of as a extracurricular activity. So I did that. That's the first time I was exposed to the Chinese flutes. And then since then, I was just obsessed with it. I would just practice like 8 hours a day. And then my neighbors, my parents would just be so annoyed by me practicing it for so many hours every day. And then I met my teacher. I had some very systematic lessons with him, from the very basic techniques of the Chinese flutes to something that's more advanced. And he also introduced me to the Western flute and also composition. So that's how I got into the Western classical world. I was thinking of where to further my study, and I was very interested in music. That's what I want to do in my life. So I was doing a diploma in flute performance in Malaysia. It's a 3-year program. And then I also gigged a lot in Malaysia in orchestra, in both in Western flute and Chinese flutes. And then after that, I was like, maybe I should further my studies overseas. And then I got into a community college in South Texas. It's called Del Mar College. It's a 2-year program that I did there. And I went to University of Houston to get my bachelor's degree in music composition. And then I went to University of Louisville to get my master's degree. And then from there to Bowling Green State University to get my doctorate degree. Now I teach at Western Illinois University in music composition and music theory.
And here's Carla Rees' story.
I was a very fidgety child. I was a bit restless, and I was taken to a concert, and it was Tara Benthoven, who was this kind of amazing, kind of crazy lady flute player. She dressed in these kind of most astonishing outfits, and she was kind of larger than life in all ways. And I sat still for the whole concert, and at the end I said to my mum, I want to play the flute on the stage. And that was it. That was kind of career decision made there and then. But I started immediately with recorder lessons. And then when I was 6, I got a flute. And yeah, I've always been, like, literally since I was 3, I was always determined that was what I was going to do. And then the thing with low flutes, that kind of happened, I guess I must have been around 14, and I went to a flute summer school, and somebody said to me, you're tall, you can play the alto flute. And it just completely blew my mind, the fact that it was a flute, and it kind of worked like a flute, but it had this just so much nicer sound. It was kind of richer and more expressive and kind of deeper and less of the screech and a lot more of the soul. That was my kind of general connection with it. So I saved my money. I was, as a sort of 14, 15-year-old, I was teaching the flute, and I charged £3 a lesson, and the alto flute cost £1,000. So that was a lot of flute teaching that I did to save up the money, but eventually I managed to buy an alto flute. And then I didn't know anyone that could play one. I didn't know anyone else that had one. So I had to learn how it made it sound. And I started a process that I've kind of done ever since, actually, with various different instruments, but kind of starting essentially with what's the instrument telling me? So rather than taking everything I know about flute playing and applying it to the instrument, sort of almost starting from scratch and thinking, how do I make the sound? It's got this kind of distinctive sound. What do I have to do to create that sound? So, yeah, kind of fast forward a little bit, when I was at the Royal College of Music, I was also doing second study composition. So I met a lot of composers. They'd all written to death for the flute, and they'd sort of gone, oh yeah, we've done this. What about this new sound? And they were all very excited about writing for alto flute. So that kick-started a whole load of collaborations with composers, and a whole load of new repertoire. And I kind of haven't really stopped since. That's become my thing.
The alto flute is a little bigger than the concert flute, both in length and diameter. It's pitched in the key of G, so that's a fourth lower. But despite the relatively small difference, it has a very different sound. Carla shared some moments where you might have heard this instrument before.
I think if you're interested in orchestral music, the chances are you will have heard the alto flute in the Rite of Spring. Obviously, you've got some fantastic solo moments in there. Also the Planets by Holst. That's in the score. It says bass flute, and I've had a load of people get in touch with me saying, oh, I need to hire a bass flute for the Planets. It's like, no, it's an alto flute. But that's because at the time the piece was written, it was the lowest member of the flute family, so it was called a bass flute in G. And the other big orchestral piece is Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe.
Next, Carla told me about the limitations of the alto flute, the development of a new fingering system, and some repertoire she's commissioned and premiered.
Other sorts of limitations that came up. I mean, the alto flute, standard alto flute, it's got closed holes. So a lot of the extended techniques that you could do on the flute, that we were also discovering at that time, kind of around 2000, when I was at college, Robert Dick had his books out, and was just sort of starting to come into sort of standard ways of playing the flute, really, that you'd do multiphonics and you do all these extra things. But the alto flute was really limited because it had closed holes. And a lot of the composers were asking me, can you do this multiphonic? This is a cool one. Does this work on the alto? And I had to keep saying, no, sorry, can't do it. Don't have the open holes, can't do it. And then I met Ava Kingma, and that was a total game changer, because Ava at that time was starting to develop what the Kingma system existed already on the flute. And this is the idea that you have essentially an open hole for every key. So that meant suddenly, if you applied that to the alto flute, you could have all of the quarter tones and all of the potentials for multiphonics and extended techniques and all the things that you might want to do, what you could do on a normal flute plus a load more. So I was very lucky with my timing that I managed to get the first complete Kingma system alto. I think it was the first one with the whole range of quarter tones. And then that was basically, that was it. That was my career. That was what I was going to do. And of course, since then, because I played alto flute, then people would say, well, of course you must play bass flute. So I was like, yeah, sure, I played the bass flute. And then I got a bass flute. And then in 2007, I got the first upright Kingma system bass flute. So that opened a load of possibilities. And then a bit later on, it was kind of like, well, you must play the contrabass flute as well. So then I managed to get a hold of a contrabass flute. So I've got, I've now got this reputation that I do all low flutes, and I do, and I love playing all of them, but alto is really my main true love.
Carla Rees has been a driving force for developing the low flute repertoire, and in particular, repertoire with quarter tones, so think notes in between the keys on a piano. She highlighted some recent pieces that she has premiered that use the alto flute really well.
So the first piece is by a German composer called Claes Biehl, and the piece is called Eosphoros. And Claes he's a long-term collaborator of mine. We've been working together for sort of 20 years or so. We've studied our PhDs together at the Royal College. He's influenced by complexity, but he's also deeply expressive, which is kind of same as like two things that in a way shouldn't go together, but somehow they do, and it's absolutely amazing. And I find that every time I play one of his pieces, it challenges me in all kinds of ways, but it also brings out things. Quite often I'll look at the piece and I'll think, oh, that's not going to be possible. And then suddenly it is possible, and it's made me a better player. But also it's made me express something a bit deeper musically. One of the other composers that I worked with a lot is Sungji Hong. So she's based in the US now, but she's a Korean composer and she studied in the UK. And she wrote me a piece called Fatni for alto flute. Fatni means manger, and a lot of her pieces have a kind of religious connection, but they're also very, very carefully written. She's very interested in sound, and she's very interested in creating exactly the right kinds of effects, lots of attention to detail. And then the other composer that I've encountered relatively recently for the first time is a guy called Jean-Patrick Besingrand, and he's French but also living in the States. And he's written me a couple of pieces, but the really imaginative kind of sounds and techniques, and just a different way of approaching sometimes the same techniques that get used in other pieces, but in a really kind of imaginative and colourful way. So many amazing pieces, and in lots of different styles. And one of the things when I started off my career was that I was told actually that the chances of having a career as an alto flute player is pretty small because there's no repertoire. So I was just like, well, I'll go and create it. But it's also important if you're creating a repertoire, and I learned this fairly early on, that you've got to create music that works for everybody. So, for example, the kinds of pieces that I do through my research are quite difficult pieces, and they're pieces that are going to challenge me, and I love challenges. But then I discovered I try and give those to students, and they'd just be completely lost because it'd be much too hard for them. So there also needs to be music that's going to appeal to amateur players, music that's within reach of students. And I've done a lot of work with composers on those kinds of pieces as well. So, for example, David Bennett Thomas, fantastic composer, has written me several solo alto pieces, and then recently a set called You Can Dance If You Want To, which is alto, flute and piano, which is based on quite popular dance styles, and it's not super easy, but it's just really approachable music, but really well written.
Let's talk piccolo for a few minutes. Piccolo literally means small, and this instrument is about half the size of a flute, about a foot long. It plays an octave higher than the flute. Jeana filled me in on some of the iconic repertoire and what makes this instrument special.
The piccolo is the greatest instrument ever invented. It is teeny tiny, and yet it screams over the orchestra. So to me, the most fun stuff is to play it in a group, either a band or an orchestra. The great piccolo solos include, Tchaikovsky 4, that third movement thing where you're actually a drunk soldier walking home. There's, of course, the Stars and Stripes solo that everybody waits to hear. And then there's the great one, the great piccolo and tuba duet at the end of the second Holst suite for bands that I think about a lot. But there's so much great stuff, and by I want to say the 70s or 80s, Wally Kujala actually, and others like him, he was my teacher and the piccolo player for the Chicago Symphony for so long, started commissioning solo works for piccolo because they had cultivated this great sound on the instrument, could play it as beautifully as the flute, and didn't want it to just be this loud screaming thing up over the orchestra, which is what we get to do most of the time. And we really hadn't had much since the Vivaldi concertos for sopranino recorder, which is what is still the concerto that you usually play if you do a piccolo audition. Is there's 2 C major ones and there's an A minor. There's also, I think Thea Musgrave wrote a piece for piccolo. Samuel Adler, like these kind of bigger American ends of the 20th century composer names wrote. I think the NFA commissioned a lot of them.
Next, I talked to Hongda Chen about Chinese flutes. He plays 3 different types.
So there are 3 types of the Chinese flutes that I play. The most standard type is called the dizi. It's spelled Dizi, dizi. It looks like this. It's made of bamboo, a piece of bamboo. And then it's kind of like the Western flute. There's a blowhole, and then there are 6 fingering holes that you press on with your bare fingers. And then in between the blowhole and the finger holes, there's another hole, which is for the membrane. So basically, when you blow air through the Chinese flute, the dizi, the membrane will vibrate. So it will make a buzzy sound. And then the second type of Chinese flute is the xiao, Xiao, xiao. It's the first tone, xiao. You play it like the recorder. You play it this way, and then it sounds very mellow. It doesn't have the membrane, so it's comparable to the flute of the Western flute. And it also made of bamboo, and it doesn't have key mechanism, so it can do the techniques that the dizi can do. And then the third type is called the Xun, Xun. It's the Chinese ocarina. It's made of clay. It sounds very much like human voice. It's very mellow. It's like a person is singing. So So these are the three Chinese flutes that I play. Yeah, so in a standard Chinese orchestra, these are usually used. They come in different keys. So obviously the shorter dizes, they play something that is faster and more brilliant, more bright and stuff like they would imitate, for example, a bird call in a Chinese orchestra piece, and the lower dizi, they will usually play something that's more mellow and slower. That's very obvious, obviously, just like a flute or alto flute or piccolo and bass flute, kind of like doing the same thing. And xiao is not very commonly used in a Chinese orchestra. It's usually used as a solo instrument. Like it's a melody that's very important that it should be played by the xiao. Then that's when the xiao is used. Xin is very very rarely used in a Chinese orchestra because the sound is very soft. You can't overblow it. It only has one octave, so there's in terms of dynamics, there's only so much a Xin can do. So these are used the most in Chinese orchestras.
Instead of Chinese orchestra, I thought it would be more fun to share one of Hongda's compositions using these instruments. Almost Identical incorporates Chinese instruments as well as string and percussion instruments from the Western European tradition. While we're going back in time, I wanted to learn from Jeana about Baroque flutes. First, she contrasted it with the modern flute.
The first thing you realize when you play a Baroque flute is that you didn't know you needed those keys on the modern flute until you don't have them. Because those keys give you the opportunity to play with a consistency that is necessary with anything from the 19th century forward, as far as intonation and chromaticism and tonality, the kind of tonalities that you have to play in. So it's just a lot. It's a more complicated machine that makes your life simpler. But on the Baroque flute, it has one key and 6 holes, no thumb key or anything. So some of the fingerings are the same, but a lot of them are very different. And the first thing you notice is that you can't blow with the same kind of big air and big air support that you use on modern flute. You have to, if there's a note on the Baroque flute, say E natural, which is not a friendly note, the answer on modern flute is, oh, I'll just play, give it more support and more air. If you do that on the Baroque flute, it sounds even worse. You learn to play with like a bellows kind of air that is sometimes constant and sometimes relaxed. And you get all these amazing colors. And then you also start to get a harmonic rhythm or melodic rhythm going that it was clear the composers knew, the ones who wrote really well for flute or were themselves flute players. And that's what I mean by the instrument sort of starts to dictate how you're going to play.
Then I asked who were some composers who wrote well for Baroque flute.
Telemann. I don't know that there's evidence that he played wind instruments, but he had to have, because he wrote so much for all the different wind instruments. And he goes to Paris, where all of the great flute players were. Telemann wrote the Paris quartets and a lot of sonatas that are just, you can tell where the weak and the strong beats are based off of where he puts those notes. The Bach sonatas are actually not all great, but I would say maybe the E minor Bach sonata or the B minor Bach sonata, because those are in keys that are friendly to the flute. You really can't play very well in flat keys, but the recorder could. So sometimes, like the Handel Opus 1 sonatas say that they're for flute, they may have been for recorder because there's an awful lot of them in flat keys. The Haute Terre suites, he was a flute maker, and so it just sort of fits the instrument really nicely.
Now we've heard all kinds of flutes: piccolo, alto, bass, Baroque, modern, Chinese. So I wanted to leave you with some final thoughts from our guests about what the flute means to them and what they hope it means to you.
Well, I think the flute is both flutes are great instruments to appreciate and to write for. I feel like flutes are very close to human voice, so it's very close to us. So when you hear a flute is being played, it sounds like someone is singing. I think that is a very good thing to appreciate, just for myself. Because when I play the flute, I want to imagine myself being a singer, like thinking about how to phrase certain pattern. I think that's something very enjoyable for me as a musician.
It's very interesting how these instruments are a bit like chameleons, and they've got a lot of potential for a range of tone colours, and depending on their use, they'll sound different. So there's, they're probably more often heard than you might imagine, but maybe not necessarily easy to identify. And because the sound can change so much between different contexts, you might not know that one is the same as another.
I think there's a desire to go back to those Renaissance days because it was a family of instruments with low to high flutes, transverse flutes, not just the recorder. And it sort of got split up when we got into the modern instrument because it got so expensive to make alto and bass flutes and stuff. Once you master the just blowing across the embouchure hole, because that's really the hardest part of it, the fingering system and all of that is, I think, a lot easier than clarinet and saxophone and bassoon. It's a little bit easier system to learn. It's just an instrument that a lot of people can play and play well and enjoy. And I wish that I think our musical world is trying to bring that back. And I hope that we can get there.
Thanks again to my guests, Hongda Chen, Jeana Melilli, Carla Rees. For the sound clips, check out the show notes, and thank you all for listening. Until next time, I'm Adam Scott Neal, and you just heard about flutes on Instrument Cases.